and especially to welcome Roland Reichenbach from the University of Zurich. Roland's made an immense contribution to philosophy of education around the world, and particularly in Europe, occupying a very central role, being in Zurich, previously in Basel. And Roland's excellent in bringing together different language cultures, as well as just being a very gregarious and welcoming person. And you also have many connections outside Europe, in North America, and especially in Korea. And all the better for that, I think, too. So I'm delighted to welcome Roland. He's got great interests in political education and in philosophy of teaching. And tonight he's going to speak on the topic, those who speak truthfully must have a rapid camel. School as a place of exchange and willful deception. Welcome, Roland.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation, your kind invitation, Paul. And I was really glad to accept it. You told me 45 minutes, and please tell me, it will not be longer than 45 minutes, okay? I have some slides that I would like to show, and I have to read some text. It's not too much, but I think that's easier. Otherwise, I will hustle around and say things which might not be very less comprehensive even. If you don't mind, I will put now the slides on. I guess I should have the right to do that. Yes, here it is. Thank you, Judith. So this is the topic, school as a place of exchange and willful deception. This proverb is apparently an Arab proverb, which I like. Those who speak truthfully must have a rapid camel. Actually, I don't know where I picked it up. It was a long time ago, but it's something that interests me. The relation to truth, the ideal of authenticity in institutionalized school. What I do here is actually, I would say, a critique of the ideal of authenticity and truthfulness in the institutionalized context of education. A critique of this regulative manner. Of course, I'm not against this ideal of authenticity, but I think the pedagogical discourse in many places is a sermon, which I think is problematic for some people. And the privileged people, they have more possibilities to be truthful, but maybe they're less truthful. And that's what I'm talking about. I would say to be privileged as a pupil or student is to know how to play the game of exchange and deception. Actually, my interest is the relationship of exchange and deception and the exchange of deceptions, which I would see as an ambivalent phenomenon. I'm not criticizing deception, and I'm not saying it's a good thing. I think it's an important thing, and we should study it. That's what I try to say. It has. I'm personally involved in that. I did several unsuccessful attempts to get support for research in this field, and I think this is apparently in the German-speaking world. The word deception, Täuschung, has a really negative connotation, but there are deception theorists which see that more differentiated, and I think that's a good thing. At the moment, I have a project on political literacy in the migration society. It's a very explorative project. It's a tri-national project. It's in Berlin, Vienna, and Zurich, and we are looking at experiences of 14, 15-year-old pupils in different school types, more privileged or less privileged pupils and situations. And of course, we know that the world is unfair, but I think the educational research could give more effort to understand it. as you know, there's the Matthew effect and the Pygmalion effect. Matthew effect mainly means that the difference at time 1 will get bigger, will increase in time 2. And we know that, everybody knows that, and a lot of educational research is about showing these effects, but understanding them is something different. And I would say what I try to do here is to offer some theoretical perspectives to understand social interactions in schools. It's not sociology that I do here, but it's linked. It's you could look at it psychologically or sociologically, but I try to understand these ideals behind, and I think it's very ambivalent, and that's what I want to say. So we have to understand the interactions in school and why the privileged, I would say, are better in deceiving themselves and the others, and teachers take profit, and from that both take profit. And if less privileged children and pupils are authentic, they harm themselves without knowing it. And that's why I'm talking about this pedagogical sermon, where the ideal of authentic communication has a very ambivalent role, actually. So I will talk about, it will not be very systematic. It should be more systematic, I know. But I just want to give you some views or impressions on that topic, and maybe then in discussion we can do that more systematically or discuss it critically. Years ago, when I was in Münster in Germany, I started with this topic, and we were looking at the strategic and tactical knowledge of pupils in schools. And it's I found it was wonderful how the pupils, as everybody knows, have to deal with the expectations in school and how they use their skills, social and self skills, to make the situation in school more bearable in a way. And these are paraphrased paraphrased and resumes of talks with the students. And I just want to give some impressions to you, 5 examples of what I'm talking about. Here, first example: a teacher always gives me only poor grades. I know I'm a poor pupil, but he doesn't see how much effort I put into my work or why I've lost interest in the subject he teaches. I notice that not even my pretended interest in the subject that I try to show by constantly raising my hand in class changes everything for the better. Thus, I've lost all interest. This is a sort of loss of control, the relationship, the quality of the exchange between the student and the teacher. Another example: if a teacher always calls on me to answer in class because she obviously expects good answers from me, it doesn't bother me that she teaches rather boringly and her subject doesn't interest me very much. Even so, I don't like to disappoint her and study at home more than necessary most of the time, which means the teacher gives something to me, she expects something from me, so I'm under pressure to give her something back, and I do it even though it's not really interesting me what she's talking about. Third one: I know of one teacher who is known for having a romantic streak. Most of the time I write schmaltzige, kitschy essays because I know they will get better grades. One must always show emotion in her class. Fourth one: one teacher who claims to be an expert in his subject promptly responds to challenges and feels he's under attack. Especially that's true for instance, language education. I speak out when I know that the truth is opposite of what he insists it is, so I only raise a question or say nothing. Last one, we always claimed we would need more time with teamwork and protested. First, because we would have more time for ourselves. That is, the time would pass faster. Second, the teacher always believed we were seriously working. And third, the way we presented the teamwork results didn't matter anyway, because the teacher was always satisfied with us girls. He's a very nice man. So here I'm talking about this sort of economic behavior, which it's actually not economic behavior, but it was termed that way first, also in the 80s, which I think is interesting and helps to explain increasing differences between groups of pupils in school and the differences between schools, I would say. And here we have Ziehe und Stubenrauch, who wrote that many years ago. They were criticizing it, actually, the school, but I would not do that. I would try to describe these effects and then ask what we can learn from them. Over the years, pupils learned techniques to spend entire mornings without knowing afterwards what content has been covered in the classroom. So we have a good school situation. We have a school situation in which pupils behave very economically. They must evoke a maximum of positive impressions with a minimum of participation. The teachers do something similar. They must awaken a maximum of impression themselves with as little preparation time spent for teaching as possible. If they can manage this, they appear to be good teachers. So I'm not saying that there should be, of course, a pedagogy of deception, but that there is. And deception may be viewed in an ambivalent way, and I think that would be the proper way to look at it. As philosopher David Nyberg wrote, deception is an essential component of our ability to organize and shape the world, to resolve problems of coordination among individuals who differ, to cope with uncertainty and pain, to be civil and to achieve privacy as needed, to survive as species and to flourish as persons. When we look at the other philosophers and more traditional ones, I found it very interesting a couple of years ago to read more profoundly the Anthropologie in pragmatischer Hinsicht, anthropology from a pragmatic point of view of Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant, who welcomed moral rigor and was not accused of it without reason, pointed out comparably positive aspects of deception. In this writing, Anthropologie, he offered a subtitle called From the Moral Appearance Permitted. And he wrote, nature has the inclination to welcome deception, wisely implanting it in humanity, even to rescue virtue or allow being led there. And he adds, a good honorable propriety is outer appearance, which influences respect from others. Anyway, everything which one calls decorum is nothing more than the appealing appearance. Deciding between the moral and the social Kant is probably not far-fetched. The social side is polarized in another way, to deceive and defraud each other without lying underlies Kant's decorous society, which creates the power to improve from deception games. And here he goes. The more civilized human beings are as a whole, the more they tend to put on acts of modesty to gain the respect of others for their own benefit without actually deceiving them about it, since it is not implied that the other person is necessarily in agreement. It is also very good that the world revolves in this manner. Although Kant's pre-sociological role-play theory could be convincing, it shifts back again to the morality at the center of the equation. Quote, because people play these roles so that they contrived so that the contrived nature of their acts and ultimately their apparent virtue awakens a momentary sense of reality and become their actual convictions. Truly long-term societies would be unfriendly barbarian groups of authentically antipathetical molecules. In short, authenticity may be an ideal for relatively close long-term bonds, but it can only serve as a convincing ideal for rather close institutional ties to a limited extent. The ability for self-deception belongs to the underestimated and obviously ironic social skills. The fact that the teacher also deceives them, that teachers also deceive themselves, mainly in a direction toward self-image or the assumption that others perceive them positively, has not only, let's say, antidepressive effects, but may even more likely create a positive learning climate from mutual and self-deception. For how does one learn to develop an interest, for instance, in mathematics, if that interest isn't already present? It requires one to behave as if mathematics were interesting. So this kind of as if philosophy is very important. In this way, one does not only develop such an interest, but even learn something about mathematics in the positive outcome. Developing interest by imitation and imagination is also a form of education and emotional training. So how do pupils, students, children, whatever, young people manage to develop interest in binomial formulas at 8 a.m., in French verbs at 9, in the rasping tongues of snails at 10, and Martin Luther at 11, and osmotic systems at 2 o'clock? If they really manage it, pedagogically is nearly unimportant. And the question is whether, how, and if they are able to pretend they themselves are interested in all these subjects. The issue may be seen as motivational psychology or didactics. However, in my opinion, it should be viewed as a strategic, strategic, not in the sense of learning strategies or something, but rather as a strategy to make contact with the learn situation. Not only leadership strategies, but also strategies of being led or allowing oneself to be guided belong to pedagogical strategies and strategies. While the claim to analyze all educational and training processes with exchange theory is hardly convincing, important interactions in the school curricula can be enlightened from this perspective. Teaching is practiced communication that consists largely of teachers offering individual pupils or a class of them in more or less brief succession according to formal instruction or format instruction in a more or less direct manner that should either be followed promptly or whose completion should be carried out by a later deadline. As in any asymmetric, I hope that's the way to spell it, as in every asymmetric relationship with roles that complement each other, this occurs through a dominant communication maneuver with which a specific order can be provided as an assumption of institutional teaching and learning. The task of pedagogical leadership and authority is to establish a flexible social balance. That means specific recognition conditions in which dominant and inferior positions, though the difference may also be slight, are distinguishable. This relationship can be critically questioned and interpreted according to normative ideals in regard to its complementarity and reciprocity. Nevertheless, there is little opportunity to provide communication basically free of dominance in the pedagogical field. The difference between superior and versus inferior here must in no way fall into the difference between powerful and powerless. On the other hand, consistent symmetric communication always leads at least to escalation, even when resulting from overall symmetric long-term relationships. Symmetric communication, in this interpretation, is the constant refusal of those involved to assume the inferior role. Thus, complementary roles in functioning communication relationships repeatedly call for the permission and readiness of the individual to assume the inferior position temporarily. Therefore, it is almost unavoidable to expect the so-called disguised dominance maneuver. The asymmetric relationships are veiled in communication terms in order to enable politically and pedagogically correct means of contact. Thus, the problem of give and take in negotiating instruction is diffused on both sides of the structural difference. It makes a great difference if one actor commands something of another, or if he or she kindly requests that he do something. That is, if he requests something he should do, for example, by formulating it in a friendly way, or simply uttering a hope by articulating a need, or a so-called I message expressing a feeling. However, the extent to which a lingual negotiator wants to impact a specific behavior with others through figures of speech prompts all efforts mentioned to be understood as more or less concealed dominance maneuvers. The so-called active listening may present the subtlest form of hidden dominance. So I showed this figure. You might not like it. I kind of like it. It's about the motivation to adjust and the motivation to resistance or reactance, and this is the effort of influence, for instance, of the teacher towards the student. Dominance maneuvers are social impact efforts in power and authority relationships, reinforcing the addressee's motivation to adjust at the outset through the tendency to conform. People try to conform, they follow at first. But then if the assertion of influence is perceived as too strong, this line here, there a second motive becomes increasingly active, the tendency to regain the lost freedom or the freedom perceived to be threatened. Hence, the motivation to react or resist emerges. Like Brehm called it reactance in his theory of reactance. That was in the 60s. The reaction is only latent at first, and the adjustment motive remains in effect here, at this place here. But it can be manifested later, and the pupil, for instance, may express his or her displeasure and even refuse to follow a teacher's instruction. At this point, it becomes obvious that pupils in general are not very clever if they often allow their resistance to dig in unchecked and their reactions to manifest themselves overtly. On the other hand, it could be important for teachers not to exaggerate their influence directly or awkwardly and to conceal it where it helps. For this reason, teachers might ask, would you like to start out? Or they invite the children to participate more often and become active in any sense. They may view themselves simply as guides of learning arrangements, active in schools viewed in which one speaks of learning offers and even mandatory offers. However, in order that the resistance remains moderate or never surfaces, the obedient pupil must experience a payback for adapting. Obedience can be understood as an act of social exchange. Yet, as mentioned, the power or powerlessness of individual actors must not coincide with their structural positions. It is quite possible that the structurally inadequate or inferior positions, at least occasionally, is linked with greater authority. And conversely, pupils might regard the teacher as an authority figure only to a very limited extent, if at all. But even in such cases, subjective benefit of obedience may be considerable for pupils. Hence, the exchange relationships affected may simply represent shows of simulated recognition, which is very important, of authority and simulated obedience if important grades are threatened to turn out poorly. Faked recognition of authority may be a solid base for successful scholarly careers, whereby deceptions can refer to both recognition of authority figures as an office holder or as people and representatives of a sphere of value or vested interest. In contrast to the economic transaction, in which it is normally quite clear who gives and who takes, social exchanges are typically unclear about whether someone who had given something before receives something and how much and when. Social exchange cause imprecise obligations. A may do B a favor and expects compensation for it in the future. But what it should be and if compensation will ever occur is not settled in advance, nor can it be negotiated. The imagined compensation depends entirely on how B gauges it. Thus, social trade-offs at the beginning of a relationship are linked with certain risks. Social exchange bonds are often emerge relatively slowly and begin with rather small transactions that demand little trust. The trustworthiness of an exchange partner is strengthened and demonstrated by fulfillment of obligations for services rendered. So a good relationship, be it pedagogically or not, is a high exchange of informal and immaterial goods, and people try to maybe to establish these relationships and then are disappointed. Here, an example by Judith Kruse. A co-worker signals that he wants to encourage development of a social exchange relationship. He works consciously, I don't know the word, sorry, and makes himself available for added tasks. When he receives no related feedback, it leads to the perception that he failed to monitor the exchange. He feels powerless in effort to shape the setting and increase his self-esteem. His efforts to receive these exchange elements are fruitless. So I would like to say that to be privileged, and one can show that, I think, in school, privileged pupils manage to control the exchange relationship because they developed or they practice their strategic skills better, or they do it in opposite to others who are not that privileged. These skills are, for instance, observing the opposite party and then assessing its resources to act or failure to do so, a factor of importance to the ego. What does he have that could be interesting, or she, for me? The skill to monitor how one masters self-control and adapt it to social expectations, and the skill to adapt the situation to one's own desires. Strategic adjustment could be grasped in the sense of Piaget's assimilation and accommodation processes or services, or as Krapman's identity-building skills, and offer general enlightenment on strategic use of social skills and social cognizance. In any case, one can distinguish specific skills and the self and relationship management categories, and it is unquestionable that these skills find use in the school and are applied, learned, and intensified or nuanced in the classroom. Who knows what satisfies the teacher creates easier terms of exchange than one who does not know and may even not know what he or she wants himself, herself. Come to this point, obedience is an act of exchange and being privileged from this exchange theory perspective. Those who may learn and live in a favorable training or education environment will also find it easier to optimize personal use of teaching and the school, if not even to maximize it. If not alone, then with the help of parents. The functioning of schools and teaching that can be reconstructed by exchange theory depends as a largely ignored bromide tells us, on two types of authority: the expertise and leadership authority of the teacher. Authority can be viewed as an exchange relationship. Each recognition relationship represents a form of exchange involving immaterial asset. But it ruins the recognition if expectations that one offers of an immaterial asset, say trust, are deeply disappointed. Indeed, in asymmetric constellations, those who must obey cannot agree. That's a nice sentence by Kopperschmidt. Those who must obey cannot agree, and those in charge must not argue or listen to arguments, but they can act as if there was an argumentation or a discourse situation. Nevertheless, obedience may be understood as an act of social exchange, and its implementation is based on conditions. Not last, many pedagogical situations deal with the ability to cope with delayed gratification. This ability consists in imagining and being able to weigh future higher profit, so to speak, or lower costs in contrast to momentarily lower profit or higher costs. A small child, impulsive and stuck in its egocentricity, is not capable of either one. For that reason, its learning is only possible to a limited degree, or its teaching. But even older children or youth, justified or not, can have great difficulty in weighing this. The short-term use that may result from refusing instructions in pedagogical treatment can appear much greater than the uncertain future profit or benefit suggested or assumed by obedience in the present by following more or less subtle treatment hints. During a seminar session, a student paraphrased what I comment here. He said the teacher represented an authority for me because she believed in me. His mathematics grades at the time had improved considerably with the new teacher within a year. I did what she wanted me to do because she gave me the feeling that she believed in me, and I had never experienced that in mathematics before, he stated. One can understand this statement as a description of a social exchange. One could reformulate it this way. You give me the feeling that you believe in me. Say, you help me to improve my sense of mathematical self-confidence. For that, I give you my attention. Such an exchange could also function as one-sided or mutual deception. You pretend that you believe in me. In return, I act as if I were interested in mathematics. Or you pretend to believe in my ability in mathematics. That is nice of you, and thus I act as if I am interested in math and pretend to follow your instructions. As an example of mutuality from the teacher's perspectives, since you do as if you were interested in mathematics, and I value that highly because I know that you can see no use for math, I not only give you the feeling that you are a great class, but a sign that you will also receive better grades. Good grades for a show of interest, not a bad trade-off. One can pretend many aspects of the lessons as a form of exchange, and one can criticize typical scenes as deceptions. One can also view teaching as an exchange of deceptions, as a mutual deception, or even as a pretense of exchange behavior or exchange actions. For each of these cases can be relevant to education, and in fact not only in a negative sense. Not only the use, but effects relevant to training about pretended interests, pretended knowledge, pretended attention, or recognition of authority may be diverse. This has less to do with the secret teaching plan or the hidden curriculum, and even less with secrecy, but rather with tacit agreement, as it is typical in long-term relationships. Oops, sorry. The ability to deceive others, including oneself, into believing that one must deceive others, may also result in productive results, as Sumner, Sullivan, Taylor, and many others showed. It is easy to criticize school settings as inauthentic, but the profit from such criticism is minimal. It would be better to understand school lessons as a relatively artificial, but a very widespread and normal interactive event, which occurs voluntarily to only a very limited extent. The coercive character of the school and teaching results in strategies to endure the necessary and unnecessary evil always associated with school. Only relationships, social and emotional support resulting from shared experience make it bearable. Even if outstanding teaching and maybe intensively interested pupils coexist, the school's lessons are often still boring. You cannot get rid of the boredom, and boredom is a form of suffering, that's for sure. But there's not only boredom, of course. School is between boredom and panic. It should be probably somewhere in the middle. Much of the school curricula is experienced or judged to be meaningless. Fortunately, this meaning of or purpose remains: the examination and the grades. Without them, the meaninglessness of the exercise would be nearly unbearable. Learning for the examination only is easy to accept if you can just believe that you also gain something for this burdensome task, which will bring profit in one or the other form. So your expectation is very important. My problem is that I cannot show the etymological closeness of in German of the word exchange and deception, Tausch und Täuschung. Maybe I'm not so into the English etymology, the background of how exchange and deception have common roots. I do not know that. But that means the privileged students or pupils, they have high expectations of the futures, and they have good reason for it. And they will not put that into danger. That's why they will be better in deceiving. If you do not expect much, you don't have to pretend at all, and that's what happens in schools where less privileged students are. And what harms them most is authentic habitus. And that's what I'm talking actually about in a way. Because even if you cannot recognize the gain now about what should affect you tomorrow, you only answer yes to the lack of sense if it promises something meaningful for the future, or at least something useful on the horizon. Failure to recognize any meaning in the activity itself may be a frequent phenomenon of school learning and teaching. Yet if absolutely no expectation are linked to this activity, and be it merely of a orchestrated nature, school business becomes an exhausting occasion for everybody involved. But for those who succeed in at least orchestrating their learning, the chance exists that the material represented in the exchange sooner or later becomes interesting. This exchange needs deception. Deception not only serves as an important means of survival, but also represents life and living well. This seems clear for deception theories, as for instance, Nyberg. He writes, deception is an essential component of our ability to organize and shape the world, to resolve problems and of coordination among individuals who differ, to cope with uncertainty and pain, to be civil and to achieve privacy as needed, to survive as species and to flourish as persons. Buller and Burgoon list the following among the deception strategies: falsifying, misleading, concealing, and remaining quiet about it, equivocating with double meanings or evasive speech and turns of phrase. The authors show that the deceptive behavior is in communicating, in contrast to the general opinion, is only poorly recognized. Nonverbal behavior in particular offers hardly reliable information. Nyberg distinguishes 8 types of deception, 4 of them active types of deceptions, and the remaining 4 as variants of passive deceptions, as you see them here. Obviously, all these deception, I'm quite at the end. Obviously, all these deception strategies also arise in everyday school and teaching settings. Morally questionable examples can be found for each of these 8 possibilities, of course, but also examples for situations in which the strategy can demonstrate normative behavior on moral grounds. This is evident in situations involving insufficient discussion on ethical fundamentals and recommendations, typically in situations important to professional ethics as well. The reasons for moral legitimacy are not necessarily illegitimate deception maneuvers. The reasons for moral legitimacy are not necessarily illegitimate deception maneuvers are diverse. While belief in a falsehood may not only fail to cause harm, but may even have positive effects, knowledge of the truth may have destructive impacts, and its avoidance is possible and ethically justifiable. In my opinion, it is an appealing but incomplete job to systemize the topic of deception from a pedagogical standpoint, and to try to formulate and discuss criteria for legitimate and illegitimate forms of deceptions and perhaps exchange in the school context. And at last, this is a continuation of the figure one can now explain the context in detail between adaptation or adjustment and resistance or reactance involving exchange and deception. While positive motivation to adapt is still marked by a total no or only slight reactive behavior here, representing the open zone of exchange, this zone is transformed by the latent reactance through increasing influence in the less transparent zone of exchange and deception. But if neither exchange nor deception is longer possible, it represents an obvious problem, maybe even conflict. In neither exchange nor deception, if neither exchange nor deception can be employed, normal teaching is impossible. And here I will stop with this presentation. And what I want to say is, when we look, the group in Berlin, Vienna, and Zurich, in some schools, the teachers really do not believe in the exchange anymore. It is in all 4 cities. It is, I think, impressive to see these differences of interaction, and it is obvious, and I think it's really obvious, that in the less privileged or underprivileged areas, the students do not deceive. They're authentic, and they harm themselves without really knowing it. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Roland, for a very refreshing and interesting talk, and one that was admirably realistic about many aspects of schooling in the real world. Can I ask people to